Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to talk about a story that will shake you to your core. Imagine this. You're standing in a foreign hospital, staring at the person you've loved for 32 years. He looks peaceful, like he's sleeping. But there's a small red mark on his forehead, and a machine is breathing for him. This isn't just a murder story. This is about a woman named Eve Henderson, who not only lost her husband to a senseless act of violence on the streets of Paris, but then had to fight her own government, the police, and a wall of bureaucracy just to bring his body home. Why did a gang on roller skates attack a 54-year-old engineer celebrating his birthday without stealing a single penny? And why, when she needed them most, did the British Consulate treat her like a stranger behind a glass partition? Today, I'm going to tell you the survival story of a woman who was turned into a block of stone by trauma, abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect her, and forced to become her own detective in a foreign land. This is Eve Henderson's story, a story of violence, betrayal, and the fight for justice that no one prepared her for. So stay with me, because this journey is going to reveal some dark truths about what really happens when tragedy strikes abroad. Imagine standing in a hospital room in a city where you don't speak the language. You are looking at the person you have loved for 32 years. He looks normal. He looks like he is sleeping. But there is a small, round red mark on the center of his forehead, and a plastic tube in his mouth is breathing for him. Eve Henderson did not just lose her husband to a random act of violence. She was about to lose her faith in the world. She stood there, staring at the man she had built a life with, and she felt nothing. She was turned into a block of stone. A doctor was crying next to her, but Eve was frozen. This is not just a true crime story. This is a survival story of a woman who had to fight the police, the consulate, and the silence of her own government just to bring her husband's body home. Why did a gang of youths on inline skates attack a 54-year-old engineer without stealing a single penny? And why, when she needed them most, did the British Consulate refuse to help a widow stranded with no money and a dying husband? The nightmare began with the perfect weekend. The date was October 1997. It was supposed to be a celebration. Roderick Henderson was turning 54. He was a hard-working man, a tool maker and engineer who had spent his life building things with his hands. Eve worked at Asda, describing herself with characteristic modesty as a glorified secretary. They were ordinary people from Swanley, Kent. They had navigated 32 years of marriage, raising children, and scraping by when they were broke in the early years. But now, things were easier. They had made it. To celebrate, they decided to splurge on a dream trip to Paris. The Eurostar was fairly new back then, and Roderick, with his engineer's mind, wanted to see the tunnel. It was a marvel of modern engineering, a symbol of connection between two worlds. They traveled with their son, Scott, their daughter, and their partners. On the train, they shared champagne and bacon rolls, laughing as the English countryside gave way to the darkness of the tunnel and then the light of France. It felt like a golden ticket. By Saturday evening, they were suited and booted, dressed in their finest clothes for a dinner cruise on the Seine. They stood on the deck of a bateau mouche, watching the lights of Paris drift by. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the bridges. It was the height of romance and safety. They toasted to Roderick's health to the years behind them, and the years ahead. In that moment, the world felt orderly. It felt just. They thought the hard part of life was over, but the clock was ticking toward midnight. And on the streets of the Champs-Élysées, a group of young men on inline skates were moving through the crowd looking for a target. Roderick didn't know it, but he was wearing his wedding ring for the last time, a ring that would soon become a piece of evidence in a bureaucratic war that would nearly destroy his wife. They had navigated 32 years of marriage, raising children and building a life. They thought they were safe, but they were about to learn the hard way that safety is an illusion. When the boat docked, the group made a decision that seemed insignificant at the time. The group split up. The three men, Roderick, his son Scott, and his son-in-law Andrew, decided to go for one last drink. The women, tired from the journey, returned to the hotel. Eve kissed him goodbye. It was a routine gesture. A muscle memory formed over 3 decades. She went back to the hotel, climbed into bed, and fell fast asleep. Meanwhile, the men found a bar on the Champs-Élysées. They had a drink. They laughed, they left, they walked no more than 30 yards. Suddenly, a rhythmic whoosh-clack sound approached from behind. There were no words spoken, no demands for money, no "give us your wallet." Just the sound of wheels on pavement and then the sickening thud of impact. A gang of youths on inline skates appeared from nowhere. It was violence for the sake of violence. Scott and Andrew were kicked in the knees. They went down instantly, their legs buckling under the force. But Roderick took the brunt of the assault. A punch to the throat shattered his larynx. As he fell backward, gasping for air, a skate kicked him in the center of the forehead. There was a crack. The attackers fled, scared off by the sound of the impact, disappearing into the Parisian night as quickly as they had arrived. Back at the hotel, Eve was sleeping peacefully. She was dreaming, unaware that her life had already shattered. Then came the knock at the door. It was Scott. He told her they had been attacked. Eve stood on the balcony of the hotel, watching the street below, waiting for Roderick to walk back. She watched the ambulances. She watched the police lights painting the buildings in flashes of blue and red. She waited for him to appear, to limp around the corner, to tell her it was just a misunderstanding. He never would. Imagine standing in a neurological ward in a city where you don't speak the language. You have navigated the underground metro with nothing but a hospital name scribbled on a scrap of paper. Now, you are looking at the person you have loved for 32 years. He looks comfortable. He has a good color. He looks like he is sleeping. But there is a small, round red mark in the center of his forehead, and there is a tube in his mouth, attached to a machine that is breathing for him. On that Sunday in October 1997, Eve Henderson stood in that room in Paris. A doctor was crying next to her, but Eve felt nothing. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She turned into a block of stone. She didn't know it yet, but the violence that put her husband in that bed was only the first blow. The second would come from her own country. Eve was a stranger in a strange land, floundering in the dark without cash, without credit cards, and without support. She expected the British Consulate to be her lifeline. Instead, she would be forced to speak to them through glass, treated like a nuisance while her husband lay dying. Why did a gang of youths on inline skates attack a 54-year-old engineer without stealing a single penny? And why did the Foreign Office refuse to help a widow stranded with no money and a dying husband? This is not just a story about the grief of murder. It is the survival story of a woman who had to fight the police, the bureaucracy, and the silence of the state just to bring her husband home. But long before the silence of the consulate, there was the hum of the train. It was October 1997. The Eurostar was still a marvel of modern engineering, a silver bullet cutting under the English Channel. For Roderick Henderson, this wasn't just a mode of transport, it was the main event. He was a tool maker, a man who understood the language of steel and pressure, and he had wanted to see the tunnel with his own eyes. This weekend was supposed to be the victory lap. Roderick was turning 54. He and Eve were sitting in those plush seats, sharing a peculiar but perfect breakfast of champagne and bacon rolls. It was the kind of luxury they hadn't known in the early days. They were ordinary people. Eve worked at ASDA, describing herself as a glorified secretary, while Roderick worked with his hands. They had spent 32 years navigating the ups and downs of marriage. They had raised children, paid mortgages, and survived the years where they were broke when we started. Now, the kids were grown. The hard part was supposed to be over. They arrived in Paris with the feeling that they had finally made it. That Saturday night, the air in Paris was crisp. The group, Roderick, Eve, their 2 adult children, and their partners, dressed for the occasion. They were, in Eve's words, suited and booted. Roderick wore his best clothes. On his finger was the gold wedding band he had worn for 3 decades, a ring that was more than just jewelry. It was the physical proof of their shared history. They boarded a bateau mouche, one of those long glass-topped sightseeing boats that drift down the Seine. It is a scene of absolute safety. The lights of the Eiffel Tower reflecting on the water, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of a family toasting a father's birthday. To anyone watching from the riverbank, they looked untouchable. They were insulated by their joy, unaware that they were drifting toward a violent deadline. The boat docked as the evening wound down. The celebration was ending, but the adrenaline was still high. It was here that the group made a casual, split-second decision. The kind of decision families make on holiday 1,000 times a day. The group decided to separate. The women, Eve, her daughter, and her daughter-in-law, decided to return to the hotel to rest. The men, Roderick, his son Scott, and son-in-law Andrew, wanted to keep the night alive for just a little longer. They decided to go for one last drink. Eve watched them walk away. She saw Roderick's back, the man she had loved for 32 years, disappearing into the lights of the Champs-Élysées. She didn't know it then, but she was watching her life fracture in real time. She went back to the hotel room, climbed into the warm bed, and fell asleep. The city outside was buzzing, but inside, it was peaceful. Until the phone rang. It wasn't a ring. It was an alarm bell shattering the silence. It was Scott, dreaming of the life they had just celebrated. She did not hear the sirens. She was woken by Scott. His voice was trembling, stripping the sleep from her mind in an instant. He told her they had been attacked. Eve didn't scream. The shock hit her before the grief could. She moved to the balcony of the hotel room and looked down at the street below. She gripped the railing, her knuckles turning white. She watched the traffic, waiting to see Roderick's familiar, heavy gait walking back to her. She told herself he was just hurt. She told herself he would look up and wave. But the street was empty. He never would. The wait ended not with a wave, but with a name scribbled on a scrap of paper. The concierge had finally located him. Eve didn't speak the language. She didn't know the geography of the city. She was simply a wife trying to find her husband in a labyrinth of underground tunnels, navigating the Paris metro alone, while clutching that paper like a lifeline. It took her an hour to find the hospital on the outskirts of the city. When she finally arrived, she wasn't led to a chaotic emergency room, but to the neurological ward. The silence there was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of machinery. She walked into the room, and there he was. Roderick looked normal. He had a good color. To a stranger, he might have looked like he was simply sleeping off the champagne from the boat ride. But then, the details began to pierce through the illusion. There was a small, round, red mark in the center of his forehead. A plastic tube disappeared into his mouth, attached to a ventilator that hissed with a mechanical coldness. Whoosh, click, whoosh. It was breathing for him. A female doctor entered the room. She looked at Eve, and tears began to stream down the doctor's face. Eve watched her, confused, feeling a strange detachment settle over her entire body. In her mind, a single, jarring thought formed. Bloody hell, am I meant to be crying? But she couldn't. The shock had done its work. It had cauterized her emotions instantly, turning her into what she would later describe as a block of stone. She stood there, a statue in the sterile light, listening, as the weeping doctor explained that the man she had loved for 32 years had a broken larynx and a massive bleed on the brain. Tears streamed down the doctor's face as she looked at Roderick, then at Eve. The contrast was jarring. The professional was falling apart while the wife of 32 years stood dry-eyed and frozen. Eve remembers thinking with a detached clinical curiosity, "Bloody hell, am I meant to be crying?" You've got no emotion. You've got nothing. You don't know what to say or where you are. Friends, imagine you are standing there. You expect to fall to your knees, to wail, to beg. That is what the movies tell us grief looks like. But real trauma is not a movie. It is an anesthetic. It shuts down the systems you don't need for immediate survival, leaving you as a ghost in your own life, watching the scene from a great distance. The weeping doctor composed herself enough to deliver the news, though the words were scarcely comprehensible through the fog of shock. The violence had been surgically precise in its brutality. The punch to the throat had shattered Roderick's larynx. The kick to the head, the one that left the small red mark, had caused a catastrophic bleed on the brain. She was trapped in a visceral reality that her mind could not yet accept. The man she had toasted with champagne less than 24 hours ago was gone, replaced by this broken figure in a foreign bed. And as the doctor wiped her eyes, Eve realized with a chilling clarity that she was now entirely alone. The police were confused, the doctors were grieving, and she was just a block of stone, waiting for a dawn that would never truly come. But the violence of the attack was only the first blow. The second came from the silence of the city itself. Eve left the hospital and stepped back into a Paris that had turned from a dream into a labyrinth. It was Sunday. The Eurostar tickets in her bag were for a train they would never catch, and when she returned to the hotel, the reality of 1997 hit her with the force of a physical strike. In a world before ubiquitous smartphones and instant banking, she was stranded. The hotel rooms were booked for new guests. Their cash was gone, spent on the champagne and the celebration that now felt like a memory from a different lifetime. She stood in the lobby with her daughter, two women holding bags they didn't have the strength to carry. They were homeless in a foreign capital, with a husband and father dying a few miles away. Naturally, Eve did what any British citizen would do. She went to the consulate. She expected a sanctuary. She expected a quiet room, a cup of tea, and a voice of authority telling her that the government would handle the logistics so she could focus on her husband. This was the safety net she had paid taxes for her entire life. But when she arrived, she found a queue. It was filled with people waiting for visas, a line of tired faces shuffling forward in a dull rhythm. Eve waited. When she finally reached the front, there was no open door. There was only a sheet of thick, smudged glass. She spoke through the partition, her voice trembling, as she explained that her husband was on life support after a brutal assault. The receptionist looked at her, then back at the paperwork. There was no offer of a private room. There was no emergency fund. There was only the cold, bureaucratic instruction to find her own accommodation and keep them informed. She walked out onto the street. The institution that was supposed to be her anchor had treated her like a nuisance. That night, they found a cheap room in a different hotel. Eve shared a bed with her daughter. In the darkness, she could hear her daughter's breathing, the soft rhythm of a child she had raised and protected. Eve lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, her body rigid. She knew she should reach out. She knew a mother should wrap her arms around her child and weep. But the shock had done its work. It had cauterized her nerves. She lay inches away, unable to move her arm, unable to offer even a single touch of comfort. She was, as she described it, a block of stone. The love was there, buried deep, but the trauma had frozen the path to reach it. The next morning brought a new kind of torture: the police. On the instruction of the consulate, Eve navigated the alien streets to a local station to request an incident number, a piece of paper required for insurance, reducing a man's life to an administrative digit. She sat in a plastic chair, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The officer across the desk did not look like the detective she had seen on television. He looked bored. When she explained the attack, the inline skaters, the unprovoked violence, he shook his head. "This is a civil matter," he said, waving a hand dismissively. Eve stared at him. Her husband's larynx was crushed. His brain was bleeding. The officer continued, offering his own theory of the crime. "He was a heavy man," the officer said, implying Roderick was clumsy or drunk or simply too old to be walking in Paris. He fell and hit his head. It was an insult so profound it nearly took her breath away. They were rewriting the history of the violence while the victim was still fighting to breathe. There was no murder squad. There was no crime scene tape. There was just a widow in waiting, being told that the destruction of her family was a clerical error. She walked out of the station with nothing but a piece of paper. She thought the attack on the Champs-Élysées was the worst part, but she was wrong. The silence of her own country and the apathy of the French authorities was louder than the violence. She was learning the hard way that when you step across a border, you are not just a tourist. You are a ghost in a machine that does not care if you live or die. Back in the neurological ward, the timeline for hope had expired. Eve waited for the scene she had watched in a dozen documentaries, where a compassionate nurse holds your hand and gently explains the end. But no one came. The doctors simply announced that the machines were turning off. There was no consultation, no soft music, just a clinical directive to say goodbye to the father of her children before the silence took over. Then the machinery of death replaced the machinery of life. Sitting in a foreign police station, tears streaming down her face, Eve was told she needed to hire a French undertaker immediately. It is a task that feels impossible when the shock is so profound you cannot even recall your own phone number. Trauma acts like an eraser. It wipes away logic and leaves only a terrifying blankness where your life used to be. The British Consulate offered forms, not funds. It was not a diplomat who saved her, but her boss from ASDA back in Kent, who quietly stepped in to pay the bill to bring Roderick home. He returned to England not as a passenger on the Eurostar he had been so excited to see, but as freight, cargo class. And then the post arrived. A plastic bag containing the suit he had worn for his birthday, unwashed and unceremoniously dumped on her doorstep. She opened it, and the smell hit her like a physical blow. Cologne and copper. The scent of his birthday celebration was now mixed with the metallic tang of the emergency room and the sterile reek of the hospital. It was a visceral reality that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Yet the bureaucracy had one final insult left. The Foreign Office refused to release his personal effects, holding his watch and his wedding ring hostage until she could prove probate. They took the symbol of 32 years of marriage and locked it in a drawer. It was theft by red tape. Eve looked at the pile of legal forms and the empty side of the bed, wishing for a time machine that didn't exist. I wanted to wake up in 5 years' time, she said, when this will all be in the past. Back in the familiar quiet of Kent, the violence of that night should have faded, but instead it metastasized into a paralyzing weight that crushed her ability to live. Eve looked at her grandchildren, desperate to hold them, to feel a connection to the future Roderick had lost, but her arms felt heavy, leaden with a shock that refused to leave her body. "I can't pick you up," she whispered. The trauma had hollowed her out, leaving her with nothing to give, because the bureaucracy in Paris was still draining her dry. While Eve was fighting just to function, the French police were demonstrating a level of incompetence that bordered on cruelty. It took months for them to even issue a public appeal for witnesses. They treated the murder of a British national with the urgency of a minor civil dispute. The trail was going cold. Eve realized the hard way that no one was coming to save her, so she returned to the scene of the crime, not as a grieving widow, but as a lead investigator with a TV news crew behind her. She stood on the exact spot on the Champs-Élysées where Roderick had fallen. She handed out leaflets to tourists, searching for a single pair of eyes that had seen the skaters in the dark. It was a desperate act, but in the absence of the police, she was the only law in town. It was during this descent into the legal abyss that she connected with the father of Caroline Dickinson, a schoolgirl murdered in a French hostel. He didn't offer false hope. He offered a map of the battlefield. He told her bluntly, "If you start this, you need to know you are on your own. There is no support out there." He introduced her to the Harburn family, whose daughter had been murdered in China, and suddenly, the isolation fractured. Eve sat with these families, learning the grim mechanics of international inquests, DNA evidence, and the exorbitant cost of truth. She realized that the Foreign Office was not a shield, it was a wall. You might think the police are there to solve crimes, but Eve learned the truth. For a murder abroad, justice is not a right. It is a luxury you have to pay for. Back in the safety of her home in Kent, the adrenaline of the fight evaporated, leaving only the wreckage of her spirit. She looked at her grandchildren, desperate to feel the warmth of new life, but when she tried to lift them, her arms refused to move. She had nothing left to give. The trauma of being abandoned by her own country had hollowed her out, turning her into a ghost in her own living room. She would go to bed praying to wake up 5 years in the future, when the raw nerve of grief might finally have calloused over. Yet while her body was frozen, her mind was being sharpened by a new, cold reality. The French police were doing nothing. It took months for them to even issue a public appeal for witnesses, a delay that in any homicide investigation is usually fatal to the truth. Eve realized that waiting for incompetence to turn into action was a waste of time. She had to do it herself. She returned to Paris, not as a tourist, but as an investigator, dragging a TV news crew to the very spot where Roderick fell. Imagine standing on the pavement where your husband was murdered, handing out leaflets to strangers who walk past without making eye contact. She stood there for hours, a widow begging for a scrap of memory from a city that wanted to forget. It was a harrowing journey back to the scene of the crime, but it was necessary. No one else was coming to help. Through this descent, she found she wasn't the only one screaming into the void. She watched closely as the family of Shirine Harburn fought for justice in China, a legal system often criticized by the West. Yet the Chinese authorities analyzed DNA, tracked the killers, and delivered justice. In the heart of Europe, however, Eve was met with silence, lost files, and apathy. It was a bitter lesson. She learned the hard way that geography dictates justice, and in France, the silence of the authorities was louder than the violence of the street gang.